the world's most dangerous power shift may have just started, and it didn't begin with a war, a missile test, or even a diplomatic crisis. It began with a ballot box inside Bangladesh. While global headlines chase conflicts and military escalations, something far quieter and potentially more explosive is unfolding. A single election inside this rapidly growing South Asian nation may determine who controls one of the most strategic economic and military corridors on Earth. And here's the shocking contradiction. Most American voters barely know it's happening. But inside the strategic calculations of leaders like Donald Trump, elections like this are never just about democracy. They are about power positioning, economic survival, and long-term global dominance. Because modern superpower battles rarely begin with troops. They begin with influence. For decades, global analysts quietly watched Bangladesh transform from a struggling economy into one of the fastest-growing manufacturing hubs in Asia. Its garment industry fuels Western retail supply chains. Its geographic position sits between India's regional influence and expanding Chinese infrastructure networks. But one overlooked detail changes everything. Bangladesh sits directly along critical maritime routes connected to the Bay of Bengal, a waterway carrying billions of dollars in global trade every year. Whoever secures long-term strategic partnerships here gains silent control over economic lifelines stretching across Asia, the Middle East, and Western markets. And that's where the geopolitical tension begins to deepen. From a traditional American strategic mindset, particularly under leaders prioritizing aggressive economic nationalism, foreign elections are rarely judged by ideological values. Instead, they are measured through cold geopolitical metrics. Which government strengthens Western supply chains? Which leadership blocks rival infrastructure expansion? Which administration allows military logistics cooperation in key maritime zones? These calculations quietly shape foreign policy attention far more than campaign speeches or democratic rhetoric. But here's where the investigation takes a darker turn. Because Bangladesh is no longer operating in isolation, the rising economic ambitions of China have dramatically intensified investment projects across South Asia through massive infrastructure financing, port development, and transportation corridors. Officially, these projects promise development and regional prosperity. Unofficially, critics warn they create long-term financial dependencies that can slowly shift political loyalties and military alignment. And that raises a dangerous new question. If Bangladesh moves closer toward Chinese-backed infrastructure alliances, how would American strategic planners respond? History suggests they rarely stay passive. Under strong national security-focused leadership inside the United States, economic partnerships often double as security strategies. Supply chain alliances become diplomatic leverage. Trade cooperation becomes geopolitical containment. This is where elections transform from domestic political events into global power competitions. And Bangladesh suddenly becomes a pressure point between two economic giants. But the story doesn't stop there. Every time smaller developing nations become strategic battlegrounds for global influence, internal political tension tends to intensify. Opposition groups begin accusing ruling governments of foreign alignment. Election transparency becomes heavily scrutinized. Protest movements gain international attention. What appears to be internal political conflict often hides external strategic pressure. And global superpowers rarely engage directly. Instead, they apply influence through trade negotiations, diplomatic statements, economic aid, or military cooperation offers. Quiet pressure. Invisible negotiations. Strategic persuasion that rarely appears in public speeches. This is where the geopolitical chessboard becomes nearly impossible for ordinary voters to see. Supporters of aggressive American foreign policy would argue these strategies protect domestic jobs, secure trade routes, and maintain global stability. Critics counter that such tactics risk destabilizing emerging democracies by turning them into bargaining tools. Both perspectives reveal a deeper, uncomfortable truth. Modern geopolitics rarely operates through morality or ideology alone. It operates through survival calculations. And here comes the midpoint twist most global audiences overlook. Bangladesh isn't just valuable because of its location or economy. It represents a testing ground for 21st century influence warfare, where infrastructure funding, trade access, and security cooperation replace traditional military conquest. Winning influence inside Bangladesh could shape power balance across the entire Indo-Pacific region for decades. Losing influence could weaken maritime logistics, disrupt manufacturing pipelines, and reduce strategic leverage in one of the world's fastest-growing economic zones. And this is where global consequences begin escalating. If Washington increases diplomatic or economic pressure to maintain alignment, Beijing historically responds with expanded investment incentives and infrastructure partnerships. If Beijing strengthens financial cooperation, Washington often increases security dialogue or trade incentives. Bangladesh doesn't just observe this rivalry. It becomes the battlefield. But unlike historical battlefields, this conflict uses contracts, loans, supply chains, and election diplomacy instead of soldiers. And here's the escalation few analysts openly discuss. When smaller nations become central nodes in superpower competition, they face immense pressure balancing national sovereignty with economic survival. Accepting one alliance risks alienating another. Attempting neutrality often invites pressure from both sides. This creates long-term political instability that can ripple through regional alliances, trade partnerships, and security coalitions. And suddenly, a national election begins influencing global defense planning, which leads to the final reveal behind this unfolding investigation. The Bangladesh election is not simply about choosing national leadership. It is about deciding which global economic architecture will dominate the next decade in South Asia. Will infrastructure financing define future political loyalties? Will supply chain alliances dictate military cooperation? Will smaller emerging economies maintain independence, or slowly become strategic extensions of global superpowers? That hidden question is what truly drives foreign policy calculations behind the scenes. And history repeatedly proves something most voters never notice. Global power transitions rarely begin with open conflict. They begin with quiet elections that reshape alliance networks, trade corridors, and security partnerships long before military tensions ever surface. Which brings us back to the contradiction we started with. The world is watching Bangladesh's election as a domestic political moment. But inside strategic war rooms across global capitals, analysts are watching something far bigger unfold. A silent decision about the future balance of global influence. So the real question is no longer about who wins the election. The real question is, who wins the strategic future that election quietly controls? Because if Bangladesh becomes the next major pivot point between competing global powers, the consequences won't stay confined to South Asia. They will ripple through manufacturing prices, defense alliances, shipping routes, and international diplomacy for years to come. And by the time most of the world notices, the balance of global power may have already shifted. Hey, if you genuinely like my video, just like and subscribe.